Hi guys, and welcome to another video. We are taking a look at the work-in-progress updates to the Messerschmitt 163 Comet. What you see here is going to be released to the next update for UP3.4 Cassie, where we yet have to decide whether that will be Hotfix 24 for patch 2, or whether the excessive amount of updates which we developed and are going to be released with the next update will be sufficient to call it patch 3. As you see here on first glance, we now have an opening canopy. It's visually represented both inside and outside. Let's take a look around our trusty rusty Comet and get back inside again and have a look at our instrument panel inside the cockpit. We are going to proceed from left to right and take a look at everything that moves or can be activated, deactivated, and is actually animated or doing something here in our game. Those things that are just visual representations and have no interaction whatsoever, we will simply skip. In the comments section of this video you will also find a link to a manual holding the whole documentation of those instruments and their meaning and what exactly has to be taken care of, so rather like a handbook for what I'm telling you here on this video. Starting on the far left, or rather on the back of the left-hand panel, we see the trim tab indicator, which shows the position of our trim tabs. When the red needle moves forwards, it indicates a nose-heavy trim, and when it moves backwards, it indicates a tail-heavy trim. For takeoff, please trim to the first tail-heavy step, which is indicated as 2100 at the moment, but those numbers might change. I'm still in the process of checking further manuals for the Comet, because currently the measurement unit, this tab indicator, is rather unclear. To the right, the next thing we see is the trim wheel. If you rotate the wheel clockwise, you will trim nose-heavy, and if you rotate it counterclockwise, you will trim tail-heavy. Next, let's take a look at the fuel dump lever. The fuel dump lever is something that can be actuated only once, so if you see it positioned horizontally, like shown here, the fuel dump valve is closed. If you rotate it to vertical position, then the fuel dump valve is open and you cannot close it back again. So once you start dumping fuel, you will dump all your fuel and you cannot close it. That can only be closed on ground by mechanics. That being said, once you land the plane again and refuel it, you know that in UltraPack we have this famous Zuti moving dogfiles server, Zuti's MDS, and Zuti's MDFs provides RRR, repair, rearm, refuel capabilities. So you can land this plane and refuel it, and once you refuel it, the fuel dump valve will be automatically closed again. Yeah, moving down a little, we see our trusty rusty throttle lever here. The throttle is a bit special on the 163 in that it has a detent between the 14% and 15% position. So in order to move the throttle lever across that detent position, you need to press and hold the boost key while moving the throttle lever. Otherwise, you will always hit the detent and it will lock there, so you can't move it either way across the detent. If I do that upwards and try to go back again, I'm locked at 15%, and if I go from idle position upwards, then I'm locked at 14%. So press and hold the boost key if you want to move the throttle across that detent position. I will explain later to you why that is so. Moving further down, we see the flap lever. If the flap lever is facing backwards, or if it's rotated clockwise, then the flaps are retracted. And when the flap lever is facing forward, like this, or if it's rotated counterclockwise, regardless how you look at it, then the flaps are dropped. Talking about flaps takes us to the compressed air supply. There are two systems on the Comet that are operated on compressed air, which is the flaps and the skid. The skid is your gear on this Comet. You know that famous cart with two wheels attached to the skid for takeoff. Once you retract your gear, which is the skid here, the cart will be dropped. And for landing, you just extend the skid and land on the skid. Now that both the skid and the flaps are operated from the same compressed air supply, there are just so many attempts you have to operate the flaps and or the skid. So don't play around with it, because once the compressed air supply has been depleted, the only thing left is the emergency compressed air supply, and the gauge for this you can find below the normal compressed air supply. The thing about the emergency compressed air supply is that it only provides limited operation of the devices using compressed air. So, for instance, you cannot operate the flaps on the emergency compressed air supply at all. Once the normal compressed air supply is depleted, you cannot operate the flaps anymore. Whichever position they are in, they will remain just in that position. Furthermore, on emergency compressed air supply, the skid cannot be operated automatically anymore, so you cannot just hit your gear key to extend or retract the skid. Instead, what you have to do is to press the manual gear extension button multiple times, if I remember correctly 16 times to extend the gear all the way through, and you can only do that for once. The only option that is left to you when the normal compressed air supply is depleted is to leave the flaps as they are and then think about whether the skid is extended or not, and if you need to extend it using the manual gear extension key, and you can do that for once, and then this emergency compressed air supply will be depleted as well, because it's just a very small tiny bottle which is just intended to extend the skid for once. To the right of this we see the skid lever. Moving it upwards retracts the skid, and moving it downwards extends the skid. It will always flip back into neutral position once moving your skid or operating your skid has been finished. Further to the right, we see a modified version of the so-called Vier-Lampen-Gerät, the 4-bulb device. This is basically the default 4-bulb device as it has been installed in other German aircraft as well. Thing is that since we don't really have a gear on this plane, it has been modified to indicate different things on the left-hand side. Right-hand side of this is precisely the same as on any other plane. If the upper or red bulb on the right-hand side is lit, the skid here is retracted, and if the lower hand right-hand side bulb, the green one, is lit, the skid is extended. On the left-hand side, the indication is a bit different and it's maybe counterintuitive. The upper left-hand bulb, the red one, has "un" written on it, which stands for attached here, and indicates the status of the cart to the skid. When the red bulb is lit, like it is shown here, the cart is attached, and if the lower left-hand side green bulb, the up gun, is lit, then the cart is detached. So that red-green meaning is a bit opposite to what we know from other planes' gear indicators, because here green means it's retracted, the cart is gone, and red means it's attached. The reason why is that in flight condition here on the 163 it is supposed to be gone, that card. Moving down on the panel, the next thing we see is a clock. The clock is nothing special to a German airplane cockpit. It usually simply indicates the time of day. Here on the Comet, the clock has second operation mode, where it operates as a stopwatch. Once you turn on the injectors to your compression chamber, which is when you move the throttle below that detent between 14 and 15%, you will switch off the first group of injectors and the compression chamber will become inactive. Once you do that, once you turn it off, the stopwatch will start running, and it will indicate the time that passed since you turned off that compression chamber or switched off the first group of injectors. The reason why this is so important is that if you do that, if you switch off your injectors and turn that compression chamber idle, you need to wait for 2 minutes at least before you switch it back on again, before you activate the first group of injectors again. If you don't wait for those 2 minutes, what will happen is that your compression chamber will blow up. And by the construction of the 163 Comet, where the fuel is being injected from two types into the compression chamber, when the compression chamber blows up, the fuel will just be depleted into the inside of your fuselage, and since this T&C stroke reaction is quite impressive, the overall result of this will be that you will simply detonate. Keep that in mind. If you move the throttle back across the detent position, you will be stuck there in that area with no thrust for at least 2 minutes. If you love living, let me add that you should not just wait 2 minutes, but maybe 10 seconds more or so. It will increase your chance to survive that stunt dramatically. A little bit up and to the right, we see the airspeed indicator, which is a dual airspeed indicator here. You can see two needles, one pointing down, one pointing up. The reason is that on the lower left-hand side, you have an indicated airspeed indicator needle, which indicates your indicated airspeed in the range of 100 kph to 400 kph. This is followed by a small gap between those two 400 indications on the upper left-hand side. And then there comes the second needle, which is the true airspeed indicator for the range of 400 kph to 1000 kph. You can see both the indicated and the true airspeed on the same gauge. This is so important because when you are about to stall or if you want to take off or land, then the indicated airspeed is what you want to and need to know, whereas when you fly at high altitude, high speed, then the true airspeed is what really matters to you to know how fast you get from A to B or how fast you approach your targets. Below this we see our altimeter. The altimeter shows the barometric altitude, or the pressure altitude of your aircraft. In that lower side window you can see the full kilometers of your altitude, and the needle will indicate the fractions of kilometers of your altitude you are flying at. Moving up and to the right we see our well-known gun sight up here. You can toggle the gun sight view and the default view, and you can also toggle that tinted screen filter here if you fly towards the sun while attacking an enemy aircraft. Then a little bit lower we have a normal magnetic compass shown here, nothing special about that. Further below and slightly to the right we have the artificial horizon together with the turn and bank indicator. There's again nothing special about that. Right below that artificial horizon we have the turbine RPM gauge. That gauge indicates the RPMs in percentage of the maximum RPM of that turbine. The turbine is what drives the fuel pump for our rocket engine, so this one provides the pressure for the T-Stoff fuel. The C-Stoff is being delivered to the engine in a different way, but the T-Stoff is set under pressure by this turbine, which is operated on that same T-Stoff, by the way. When the engine is idling, if you are in that range between 0 and 14% throttle, but the engine is turned on, then this turbine RPM indicator should always indicate at least 25% RPM. At full idle RPMs, that is 14% throttle setting, you should usually see about 80% RPM. And once the combustion has started, so once you activated group number 1 of your fuel injectors on the combustion chamber, you should always be in the range of 80 to 100% turbine RPMs. You should never exceed 100% RPMs here on that gauge. So we move further up to the right, we see the ammo counter with 2 light bulbs below it indicating the status, the breech cock status of both guns, and the so-called Schusszählerkasten, the ammo counter indicator, works the same as on other German planes. The further up that white bar raises, the more ammo is left on the gun. Below this, to the left, we have the variometer showing the tremendous climb capabilities of the 163 Comet with up to 150 meters per second climb rate. Below this, we have our fuel gauge. In real life, this is a fuel counter. The pilot would have to dial in the amount of fuel he thinks or was supposed to have loaded, and then this counter device will count how much fuel has been delivered to the injectors of the compression chamber and will subtract it, so count backwards on that gauge. Here, for the sake of simplicity, it simply indicates the amount of fuel which is left in your tanks, which in real life, if everything works to plan, if the pilot dials in the right amount of fuel and if the counter works correctly, would just be the same. Treat this as a fuel indicator showing how much fuel you have. Further to the right, we see 2 pressure gauges. Funny thing, and this reflects the status in real life, the Germans just use what they had. You see on the upper hand indicator, the units are kilograms per square centimeter, whereas on the lower indicator, the units marked are millimeters water Kelvin, which is the same. It's exactly the same. So this is a pressure gauge, just like the ones where we see in American or English planes pounds per square inch. So this is just a measurement of pressure. Kilograms per square centimeter or millimeters water column. Exactly the same. To add more confusion here, both of these pressure gauges operate on the same tube and measure the same pressure. That's the pressure of the compression chamber. So why do we have 2 indicators then? The reason is that during startup process of the engine or idling the engine, it is very important to keep low pressure rates inside, whereas when it's operating on full throttle, which is the flight condition, then you need to measure much higher pressure rates here. So that's why during startup and idling, the upper gauge is the important one. It will show you that when you really idle the turbine, you are in a range of, let's say, 0.5 to 1 kilogram per square centimeter, and that goes up when you move the throttle in the range of 0 to 40%, so you just add some more supply to the turbine. And once you activate the first group of injectors and ignite the compression chamber, then the idle pressure of the compression compression chamber at 15% throttle, when really the first group of injectors is in idle condition and barely operating, then the idle pressure is 3.5 kilograms per square centimeter. That is why it's being marked red here on that indicator. Once you throttle up, then the pressure in the compression chamber will rise quickly. The thrust is depending on the pressure in the compression chamber directly linearly. And at full throttle, you should reach about 19 to 20 kilograms per square centimeter or millimeters water column on the lower end gauge. The upper gauge will simply max out at indicating 6 kilograms per square centimeter in that condition. But as I said, the relevant one, once you pass beyond that 6 kilograms per square centimeter, the important one is the lower gauge anyway. The lower gauge should never indicate more than 20 kilograms per square centimeter, and usually when you are full throttle, it should also not be lower than 19. Below we see the exhaust gas temperature gauge. This is the compression chamber temperature gauge. This temperature gauge should never exceed 750 degrees Celsius. That's it. The only thing to keep in mind. Never go beyond that middle position between 6 and 9. And last but not least, we have the oxygen supply gauge on the right hand side, which is just as important as all the others, because on the Messerschmitt 163 the pilot wears a protective suit which does all but protecting the pilot. But one important thing about that is that once you close the canopy, the pilot will also put on his oxygen mask. Reason being that sometimes some T-Stoff rises into the cockpit area. It will not just blind your sight and not just hurt the pilot, but it would also make it impossible for him to breathe if he would not have an oxygen mask on. So for safety reasons, he will always wear that oxygen mask. And as he wears that oxygen mask constantly, it's very important to have sufficient oxygen supply at hand. The oxygen supply in the 163 Comet lasts for about 1 hour, plus minus 10%, and once that oxygen supply is depleted, it's extremely important for you to descend below 3,500 meters altitude so your pilot can sufficiently breathe again. He will automatically drop mask in this condition, and you can keep flying in that condition if you need to. Of course, it could also be that some damage to the oxygen supply system happens and the pilot will also immediately have to drop the oxygen supply mask. In this condition, you will see that your pilot gets hurt, so you will see your view turning red, and then just dive down and try to get below 3.5 kilometers altitude as fast as possible. That's it. So much to the familiarization of the 163 Comet cockpit. Let's open up the canopy again, get some fresh air, and see you in the skies. Bye, guys.